Hi everybody, I'm Chris Y'all. Welcome to ChurchNext. It's a place where people who are passionate about the local church come to hear from experienced mentors. And today we're joined by a man who's rightfully concerned about not just the juvenilization of American culture, but of the church as well. Tom Bergler is professor of ministry at Huntington University, author of one of the top books. And Tom, I think I just remember reading, isn't this the top book by, it was the top Erdman's book or the top pick of Christianity Today magazine for 2012, The Juvenilization of American Christianity. And Tom says that's not a good trend. So Tom, why don't we start right there? Welcome to ChurchNext. And
thank you.
What do you mean by the juvenilization of American Christianity?
Well, juvenilization is the process by which things that are appropriate spiritually for an adolescent become accepted and even celebrated for people of all ages.
Yeah. And certainly older people are quick to point that out, as I think probably every generation who's older is. You know, they don't dress the same way, they don't have the same manners, they don't talk respectfully there. I mean, so some of this is natural, huh?
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because some people I think misunderstood before they had read the book or the article. They thought, oh, here's another person who just thinks we shouldn't have drums and electric guitars in church or something. And it's not really about stylistic issues, really. It's more about substantive spiritual growth and spiritual maturity issues. I mean, really, one of the things that launched me on this journey was talking to students in a class at my university and asking, it was a lesson on spiritual maturity, spiritual growth, and I said, tell me, what are some of the traits of a spiritually mature person? And they simply did not like that question. And these were young people raised in church, raised in youth groups, but they thought spiritual maturity was more or less the same thing as an unattainable perfection. Nobody's perfect, we never arrive at this life, and starting to list traits is automatically judgmental, and on it went. It became clear to me, not just these students, but many, many other Christians, and frankly, the feedback to the book has shown this as well. Many Christians have lost sight of spiritual maturity as something that is attainable and desirable in this life as Christians.
But isn't historically, Tom, in North America, United States specifically, aren't we historically a mile wide in terms of we're Christian, but like an inch deep in terms of our maturity?
Well, I mean, of course, there are always, in every age, there are superficial or nominal Christians, and you know, in some ways, I see the whole Protestant movement per se as an attempt to get as many people as possible to be as fervent as possible about their faith and to not settle for anything less. So yes, there's always plenty of that around. I think what's new is in some cases at least, people celebrating that superficiality as the ideal. Yeah. That is a little bit new.
Mm-hmm. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, let me take one example. I've written on the subject of worship music, both the historical influence of youth ministries on it, but I gave a presentation a few years ago called No More Slow Dances with Jesus. And there's a certain genre of worship music that is a slow dance melody, words about falling in love with Jesus and feeling his touch and so on. And I think a steady diet of that music teaches people a very superficial, self-centered, emotionally driven relationship with God, and that is celebrated. If you tell some people, I've told people of all ages, I don't think falling in love with Jesus is a good metaphor. I don't think it's biblical. I don't think it's helpful. And you'll get a lot of American Christians who will push back very hard against that. No, this is the perfect way to understand our relationship with God.
Well, and isn't that kind of a reflection of a trend towards the more experiential in North American religious life, that you know, we're spiritual but not religious, and not in a bad way, but in ways that we are recognizing the presence of God in feelings and in, you know, the senses?
Well, you know, I mean, it's not just experiential. I'm in favor of experiential faith, but it's a totally unfettered, unbiblically grounded emphasis on experience. So, how do I know if our worship this Sunday morning was good? Is if I felt a certain way. Yeah. You know, it's individualized, subjectivized experience. So, you know, we don't look to the scriptures to say, you know, what should my experience be and how can God form my experience? We say, I have this experience, God needs to fit into that.
Well, and it's also kind of a loss of the, one of the words that goes hand in hand with worship many times is the word and idea of sacrifice, and that it's not necessarily something that has to feel good.
Right, right. And I think, we all need spiritual comfort and consolation from the Lord, but I know from my personal life history that when I went through a period of suffering in my life, I felt ill-prepared in some ways by my otherwise very good Christian upbringing to know how to handle the fact that, suffering is part of our lives. It will happen to believers. It doesn't mean you've done something wrong or that you're somehow a deficient Christian just because you suffer and it hurts and you don't. And I had to reprocess and reread. At one point, I reread the New Testament looking for mentions of suffering, and I was astonished how much of the New Testament is about suffering. I wouldn't have known that in my good Christian upbringing.
Yeah. Well, you wonder how much of this is really, playing into the culture that teaches us comfort over sacrifice. Certainly, the consumeristic ideas of ideals of value, convenience. What has me feeling happy, as if the life, the chief end of life was happiness. But doesn't some of this come from this culture that we're swimming in?
Yes, I think one of the things that I mention a bit in the book, but I think is worth exploring more, is that I think that one of the main things driving this is the consumer culture. So people who are immature make good consumers. And people who are driven by, they're not so much content as hungry for the next experience that they can consume through buying a product or going to a theme park or whatever, and constantly seeking out the next consumer product or experience, and in an endless chase after happiness, not realizing that the things that make for true happiness come from long-term investment. Much of that long-term investment on the front end might not be super pleasurable. Right now, I'm overjoyed. I'm a very happy father of a newborn son, and I'm thrilled. But there's a lot of work involved in that. And if I in the middle of the night thought, "Gee, I don't feel like getting up in the middle of the night," I'm just not going to do that. That would lead to a long-term unhappiness. So I need to serve and give and love and invest in others, and over time, that's true happiness.
Yeah, and I think Aquinas made the distinction between happiness and joy in trying to parse those two. So what I'm curious about in terms of the cultural overtones here, Tom, is this sense that there's this kind of, sociologists call it kind of this new way of being human, is that you get this stage called adultolescence, where the juvenilization, if you will, is accepted up until 30, when maybe it was only accepted at 18. Give me your reactions to that.
Well, a lot of sociologists and psychologists have identified a new life stage in American culture they're calling emerging adulthood. And it does seem that some of it used to be in some time periods, particularly the 1950s, 1960s, even into the 1970s a bit, people would get married, finish their education, get married, start having children in their early 20s. Those transitions are being delayed. Meanwhile, what it even means to be an adult has been redefined over the last couple of decades, so that there are still, thanks be to God, many mature, responsible versions of adulthood, but adulthood has become much more individualized. People talk about mix and match spirituality. That's true to some extent, but what's really true, I think, in our society is mix and match adulthood. I can become whatever kind of adult I want to be. If that means an adult who commits to a spouse and to children over the long term, great. If I say, well, no, that's not right for me anymore, that's fine too. I always have a little bit of a laugh when I see on some of these reality TV shows these people who say, I'm spending 6 months away from my family. It's for my family, kind of thing. I'm like, really? You're really on this TV show for your family? Come on, it's for you. And your family's suffering because you're off doing this thing.
Right.
But that's culturally acceptable to say, well, I'm off, separated from my family for 6 months or a year or whatever. It's for them, you know.
Well, and when we get that, I mean, you think of people in the military, and you think of people who have to be, you know, like that, and that perhaps they're trying to partake in that. I think of the ad between the old rich and the new rich that has the guy with the three-piece suit and the panel wall in back of him, and then next to the internet guys in their, you know, flip-flops and ripped jeans, of the mix and match when you bring that up. But what it means to be an adult is kind of where you started, has changed. But what it means to be a mature Christian really hasn't. I wonder if you could tell us how you're defining a mature Christian, and how you see where you see the biblical foundations for that.
You know, of course, there's a lot of material in the New Testament about kind of the Christian ideal, what kind of person we're supposed to be. But just honing in on those passages that use the English word maturity to translate what's going on there in Greek, passages like Hebrews, end of Hebrews chapter 5, beginning of Hebrews chapter 6, basically says, by now you should be eating solid food, but you're still drinking milk. Let's go on to maturity. You should be able to teach others. So from the passages like Hebrews 5, Ephesians 4, Philippians 3, I come up with things like this. A person ought to be able to understand the basics of Christianity well enough to explain it to another person. They ought to be able to understand the basis of our salvation in Christ, that it's neither works righteousness, nor does that works right, nor are we, nor cheap. It's neither works righteousness nor cheap grace. Yeah. That's what you get from Philippians 3. Paul says, I have nothing, you know, it's all Christ, but I strive and press on to know Christ. Yeah. It's neither cheap grace nor works righteousness. So they have a basic understanding of salvation and the basic doctrines and can explain to someone else. They recognize that the Christian life is a life of community with others and serving with Christ and his mission. You see that in a passage like Ephesians 4. How do we grow up into Christ? It's as each person does their part in the body of Christ in ministry to build everyone up in Christ. So they recognize that the Christian faith is not all about them and their needs and even their spiritual growth. It's about a community growing together up into Christ. And finally, I think it's especially important to emphasize that, emotionally speaking, a mature Christian recognizes and embraces that both comfort and suffering are part of the regular parts of the Christian life, and both are things that God can and does use in our lives and the lives of others. There are many others, but those are a few things that I think are important and often neglected today.
You know, I'm curious, you're just kind of piquing this question. You know, you and I have seen in our generation the vast popularity of what are commonly termed health and wealth ministries, where it's preached that, you know, comfort and avoidance of suffering are right from God, and we've seen these really multiply. Do you think that's a result of what's happening more culturally wide? And I wonder if they would have succeeded in the first century.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the whole health and wealth and prosperity gospel thing is something that could only succeed in North America, which is one of the richest, most comfortable human societies that's ever existed. And so that enough people are isolated from true suffering or from deep physical suffering. There's still emotional suffering aplenty. But anyone could even think that might be the case, that you won't have physical suffering in your life. Could only be an American thing. But yeah, I think it's gotten a little bit worse in the sense that in the culture, again, I go back to the culture of consumerism and advertising. How many advertisements do you see that advertise basically no limits is the tagline? In other words, people who create products and market those products to us want to tell us that we can experience a kind of transcendence through consuming their product, that we can experience a limitless existence. We will have unlimited possibilities, unlimited potential, unlimited whatever, unlimited emotional highs. And so, yes, culture-wide, we as Americans don't like the idea of being finite, limited creatures who will not have everything going perfectly. The reality is, I mean, sad to say, what happens then is that there's this huge gap between reality and our expectations is what happens, because nobody's life is really that good. You know, there's always something that goes wrong, no matter how wonderful your life is, and then we're totally unprepared for that, rather than realizing, hey, you know what, like a passage that's meant a lot to me in the past few years is 2 Corinthians 4, where Paul talks about the fact that it's in his suffering that he truly, same idea is really in Philippians 3, that it's in his suffering that he truly becomes close to Christ and truly knows Christ and truly experiences Christ in a way that he had never experienced otherwise. And don't get me wrong, I don't like suffering. I'm not seeking it out. I don't think we need to seek it out. But it comes, and I think there's a rich resource in our faith and our relationship with Christ that we don't know how to tap because we've ignored that whole side of things.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the evidence that it's in suffering and in our own personal pain that the most fruitful evangelism takes place. When people see courage through adversity and that kind of thing. It's not through a great light show or for a celebrity endorsing Christianity.
And quite apart from the suffering, it's just one of my big concerns that has emerged through my research is it's just gotten harder for people to really realize that it's not about them. As it says in that opening line of The Purpose-Driven Life, it's not about you. It's a lot easier to say that than it is to really deeply experience that and believe that and live that. And I think that culture has made that harder because culture says, no, it really is all about you. And it's so much about you that you need to spend a lot of money on this product that I'm offering you that's going to enhance the real you.
Yeah. No. So anyway, so you've written this book, The Juvenilization of American Christianity, and why don't you give us a few of the points that really struck you as you began putting this research down? What are some of the things that surprised you, and et cetera?
Well, one of the things that was interesting to me is the way that in the 1930s and 1940s, when I began the book, there was a huge wave of new investment in youth ministry. And it was amazing to me how people were caught up in the political events of their age, the Great Depression, the Cold War, World War II, and they thought that was what it was all about. And I see parallels today. People think today it's all about the internet and the digital age and how this is really the main thing that's happening in our world and everything needs to be shaped around that. Well, it's certainly important. Those events were important as well. But I was struck by the way in which they were so blinded in a way by these dramatic events that they didn't look more deeply and say, what's really happening with the young people that I'm working with? How much are these things really affecting them? So, for example, there was this idea that, during the Cold War era of the 1950s, that young people were really afraid about nuclear war and that therefore we know this was somehow important to youth work. Well, most American teenagers weren't really that worried about nuclear war in the 1950s, but adults get these ideas. So one point is adults are always getting funny ideas about what's really going on with young people. And sometimes it leads to creating youth programs that aren't really that helpful. Because it's more the adult idea of what's going on with young people. I've even received, someone forwarded to me a very interesting editorial one time about a guy who was reading all about how young people were bad today and even Christian young people didn't know anything about their faith, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He wrote this op-ed piece, and at the end he said, well, the kids who are in my Sunday school that I teach aren't that way, but... And I thought, well, then why are you writing this? Talk about the kid, deal with the young people that are right before you and what they're really like. So I think point number one, adults get lots of funny ideas, and we need to question our ideas and say, is that really what's happening with young people, with the young people I'm working with? What are they really like? Talk to them, listen to them, find out what they're like. Even if you read great research, research is always a generalization. Find out if the young people you're working with are really like that. And if you don't do that, it can lead to some mistakes, and that's what I saw. Another thing that struck me along the way is just how little deep theological thought went into a lot of youth ministry that was done. There was a lot of implicit theology, a lot of, obviously we know this is what it's all about, so let's get going doing it. They're youth ministry tends to be very pragmatic, very results-oriented, get kids through the door, get them doing this or that other thing that we want them to do. But reflecting deeply about what does it mean for someone to be young and to grow up to adulthood. And third, and related to that, is just how little thought there's a lot of thought that goes into either evangelizing young people or perhaps mobilizing them for social justice. Those are two big ones over the years that adults have wanted young people to do. There's less thought and effort, I think, put into asking how are we going to help them grow to spiritual maturity. We either want to entertain them or we want to sign them up for our crusade, whatever it is. But the deeper question is, what kind of people are they becoming, and how are we fostering that? And it's not like people ignored that, but if you look at the relative investment of time, energy, money, effort, evangelism and social justice were high priorities, spiritual formation to maturity, less so.
Right. To me, it costs more in terms of time and money to pay attention to that question.
Right.
You really have to. I mean, how does a kid spell love? It's Time, right?
Right.
And raising kids is tough. I mean, you've kind of talked about it in by the glory sides. But I mean, a lot of raising kids is kind of like my golf game. Every 9 holes, I will have a nice shot, but most of it is spent in the weeds and whatever. And that kid can be, get off the stove, stop hitting your sister. But the one time he looks up at you with spaghetti on his face, says, "I love you, Daddy." It's the one shot that kind of keeps you at it. But most of the round is not easy, is it? But it goes towards your idea of happiness versus joy. That at the end of the day, it brings great joy to have a child who's raised up and who's making a mark for the good on God's earth.
And I mean, I think youth ministry has been strong at helping young people have positive experiences of God and of the church. It's been less strong at helping young people really understand what Christianity is all about and why they personally should make a commitment to it. And it's also been less strong at helping young people truly understand what the church is and why they should love the church, not just love Jesus. I tell my students something that to try to get this across to them. I say, there's a lot of people today who want to say, "I love Jesus, but I'm not so sure I like the church." And I tell them, well, the church is called the bride of Christ. I said, imagine if you say to me, "Dr. Bergler, I'd like to be your friend, but I can't stand your wife." Well, we might be able to be friends of sorts, but it would certainly put a damper on our relationship. And that analogy kind of gets through to them, but that whole idea that the church is somehow spiritually, intrinsically connected to Christ, beloved by Christ, and therefore worthy of our respect and honor and love, even in all her weakness, as far as I can tell, has never crossed anyone's mind. And these are young people who've grown up in church, heard a call to ministry, and the idea that the church is something to be beloved despite her flaws seems to have never registered.
Well, they'll get married and they'll find out.
Yeah. So I think that's something that I would like to see. One of the things that I've been thinking about is, how do we help young people? How do we help youth ministers? How to love both young people and the church? Love both Jesus and young people and the church.
And I'm going to stop you before that. Because you've set us up here, Dr. Bergler, you've set us up in terms of there's a big challenge there. And bringing my kid up as a mature citizen, much less a mature, Christian. Can you begin to talk to us a little bit about some of the practices and habits and virtues that you're seeing as really essential to helping not just kids get, and I think you put it, number one is not just giving that youth ministry idea of church isn't a bad, a good impression of church, but of really understanding the Christian faith.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that's important is having genuine conversations with our children and young people about faith, including genuine conversations about what they believe. One of the interesting things to me about the National Study of Youth and Religion that interviewed a nationally representative sample of teenagers was they would sit down with these teenagers for an hour or 2 hours and say, "Okay, tell me what you believe about God and religion and all that stuff." And the researchers got the distinct impression that no one had ever asked this teenager what they thought, because they had nothing ready, because many times even young people who've been to church a lot had just totally unpracticed in putting it in their own words. So I would just say, whether it's informally in conversations or formally in our classes and catechism, get them talking a lot and putting into their own words what they think all this God stuff is about. And then conversationally, dialogically say, well, what about this? I remember sitting down one time with an older, wiser man of God who he just had us over to his house, a couple of us who were working full-time in college ministry, and he just he pulled out the scripture that said, I resolve to know nothing amongst you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And he just asked us, so what do you think that means for your ministry? Are you doing that in your ministry? And we just had this great conversation with him about it. I think sometimes, sad to say, but a lot could be overcome just by having parents and youth leaders and church members ask questions and have conversations. Sometimes, sadly, God or Jesus is the taboo conversation topic amongst Christians. So
it also suggests a level of intimacy that's very difficult to have in social discourse these days. I look at the average attendance in my denomination, which is now once a month, and it was once every 3 weeks, back when I was ordained. And I think that's not too different from where a lot of American church going is going. And so how do you begin to develop the ability to ask a very intimate question of somebody whose intimacy in that relationship is not quite there? And I think perhaps that's one thing that may turn people back. I don't know.
Well, and one of the advantages with young people is that is that I think many teenagers and even some young adults as well, people in their 20s, they're actually quite open to relationship with older adults. They don't want to be preached at and told what to do, but someone who's just asking questions, listening, being an encourager, that is very welcome. And they're indeed hungry for that. They don't know how to get that in their life. There's a couple of books by Rick Dunn on this subject where he talks about, one's called Shaping the Spiritual Life of Students and the other one's called Shaping the Spiritual Life of Emerging Adults, and where he just lays out a really simple method of being a mentor to a younger person in a way that is able to encourage them and at the right moment be a little bit directive, but is really more just kind of about listening, asking questions, and when you read it you kind of go, oh yeah, of course that's right, but sometimes adults, I think, are intimidated. I have to have the right answer. Actually, a lot of times young people don't really want to hear your answers. A lot of times, if they've grown up in church especially, they know the right answer. It's more about, is my heart ready to embrace the right answer?
Well, yeah, and is my heart ready to embrace, is this person really loving me?
Right.
Because that's kind of what you're describing, Doctor, right. Isn't it? That if you're going to take the time, you're going to look them in the eye, you're going to ask them a question, and you're really going to listen to them. That's an investment that, as time equals money and, the right. human life goes on in this environment, becomes, just as you say, just an investment.
Well, and the good news is some research on what they call natural mentoring suggests that if there is a relationship like that in place, it doesn't have to even have to be a weekly meeting for an hour or something. Just once the relationship is established, even an infrequent contact can have a very powerful effect on a young person's life. So I've read articles and research where a relationship was established, let's say at some point during high school or junior high school with an older adult, and then through the college years, when that student was home, they would get together for coffee or something, and this had a very powerful impact on the young person, even though it wasn't a huge time investment on the part of the adult.
Right, and it's through time like that we develop those relationships where you can't talk to somebody for a really long time, but you then can resume, and it's like you never stopped because you have that timeline, which churches are good at, right? Because people very often stay the same one for a while.
I think the other big challenge that we haven't learned how to overcome as a North American church is the fact that we treat the transition out of high school graduation as a transition to adulthood in the way we run our churches, but it's not really a transition to adulthood. It's not really a transition to membership in that church. It often is a transition to leaving home. If they're going to college, they leave home, then they're disconnected. So that's a really challenging issue, that transition out of high school and staying connected to the church. That's where I think we need to work more when they're younger, elementary, junior high, high school, to explain and also help them experience the church as an intergenerational family, something that they value, something that they want to invest in, as opposed to just something that's a service provider for them. So.
And don't we need rites of passage in this country? I mean, you read among other cultures where it's the American Indians or some other groups where there's a real you're training them up for, okay, it is, and in some households it's high school, and this is what you're going to do, son, and you're going to do, or daughter, A, B, C, and D. But we don't, as a culture, really have one of those, do we?
Well, it's interesting. We do have a rite of going off to college is a rite of passage, except it's not like traditional rites of passage in that it's not really closely supervised by the elders of the. If you go to a Christian
many times the elders are very happy that they're no longer in the tribe.
If you go to a Christian college like the one where I teach, then there's more involvement by adults in your life to help you in that transition. But the average state university dormitory doesn't have one of the big findings on emerging adulthood is that emerging adults, people in their 20s, all of their most significant relationships are with other people in their 20s. They have a relationship with their parents, but part of that transition to adulthood is I feel close to my parents, but I'm not sharing with my parents, my big decisions as much anymore. And so all of their significant, what am I going to do with my life relationships are their peers. So it really is blind leading the blind kind of situation. You have a bunch of people who don't have much life experience trying to make big life decisions with only each other to rely on. So that's a problem.
Well, yeah, I mean and I'm comparing that in my mind to generations past, because certainly one of the ways to help bring folk along to maturity is to put them in real relationship with people who are there. And what you're describing, especially in many of our churches, Tom, we when we send the kids off to be with the kids, and they're schooling, they're just around people their age. It makes it tough to work it out unless you have somebody approachable, who's kind of a mentor. So perhaps the solution may be with parents trying to get adults other than themselves into real relationship with their kids.
Yes, and I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me is that I think if you see an issue that gets hammered again and again, and we're constantly exhorting one another in the church to do something, but we never do it, then that's worth exploring. So we're often, for at least 100 years, perhaps longer, American Christians have been exhorting parents to do a better job parenting their kids, spiritually. But also then we've also said we need to do better mentoring of our young people in our churches. Those are two solutions are brought up again and again. We seem to have a hard time really implementing much. And because of the way it's structured, right? Because you go to church and there's activities, maybe there's youth activities, maybe there's not, but fostering intergenerational relationships in an intentional way is not how most of our churches are set up. To take an example of a church that said, we're going to invest in this, a youth ministry in fact, what they said was, okay, we want parents to have spiritual conversations with their youth, with their children. But if we just say, do this at home, we know that that's probably not going to happen. They need to be equipped. They need to be helped. We need to facilitate that. So what they did was they said, okay, once a month on our Wednesday night youth meeting, the parents are going to come. The parents and the youth are going to sit in the same room and hear the same sermon or whatever it is teaching. And then they're going to go sit around tables and discuss it with their parents at the youth meeting. And if someone doesn't have parents who come to church, we have other adults who are going to be their spiritual parent during that time. And so we use that time within the church walls to say, okay, we're going to, put the generations together and hopefully spark conversations, show the youth and their parents that, gee, I can talk to my kids or I can talk to my parents about God and it wasn't so bad. And, because if we just tell people, we have a tendency, I think, in the church to tell people to do things rather than equipping them and helping them to do things.
Well, no. I think we often, and some of it may come from our years in the hallowed halls, Tom, where we, because the gap between what's really happening in the pews and what the pastor wishes was happening, it continues to be large. But certainly that easy exercise of granting time for a congregation to have a discussion about what's happening in their life as a community and in their interactions with Scripture. Boy, it's not rocket science, is it?
No, it really isn't. But what we're up against some, like I said, structural obstacles. Our society, in the past practices in the church tell us to have separate activities for different age groups, which I'm in favor of that. There is a stream of people out there who say all age-specific ministries are unbiblical, and I don't subscribe to that philosophy. It's out there; you can find it, but
there's also something to the fact that, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, that you're willing to tell a group of your peers something that you don't want your grandmother to hear.
Right. So there are legitimate and helpful reasons to separate people by age. There's different interests, but then we need to be just as intentional about creating those intergenerational spaces and having those intergenerational times be not just socializing, not just chit-chat, not just snacks. That's great. That's part of community life, but also fostering spiritual conversations and service intergenerationally. And many churches are doing that, and they experience very great things from it. And the best youth ministries, even though technically speaking it's a segregation, if you will, of youth, what's happening is they have lots of adult volunteers, and the youth are forming really strong relationships with those adult volunteers. So that's an intentional way to build that intergenerationality.
Right. And so, this idea of finding ways to, I know, my church has embarked on a program where we intentionally match adults with children who are not related to them in order to pray for them and to lift them up. And we publish those names in the bulletin, and they on their birthdays and that kind of thing. So, right. You try to build these relationships, and you're saying there's some credence to that.
Yes, I think that, my book, and I'm working on another follow-up book that's on these kind of issues, what can be done.
Yeah.
One of my main points is going to be keep it on the agenda. Keep spiritual maturity fostered in intergenerational relationships on the agenda. Because the reality is, adults investing in children and youth is one of the best ways for us as adults to grow.
Yeah.
To reach maturity in our faith if we haven't reached it already. One of the reasons many adults don't mentor or don't talk to their kids about faith is that they're pretty hesitant about it themselves. They're not sure they understand it. They're not sure what they would say. They're afraid their child or this young person will ask them something they don't know how to answer. And so, sometimes we, don't want to make the investment because it's costly. So for all of those reasons, it's good for us as adults to be in those relationships. It draws out our maturity, it draws out our spiritual growth.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it forces you in a society that continues to delay maturity. These life milestones, marriage, having children, really kind of forces you to say, well, gosh, now I have to actually be a spiritual mentor to this person, and I don't really know what I believe. Our children teach us, don't they?
Right, and I think that's why it's good to do some things like that church I mentioned where they said, okay, inside the four walls of the church where we can get help, let's get adults and youth talking together about faith, and it will unearth the questions, and we can talk about it, and the pastors there or others are there who are more experienced, more knowledgeable, who can help, and people can see that faith is about learning. One of the things that I stress so much with my students, I teach a class on discipleship and one-on-one and small group discipleship, and one of the things I stress to them again and again is the word disciple means learner or student. So if we're a disciple of Jesus, we should always be learning about Jesus and learning his ways, and that means learning them not just factually in our heads, but experientially and practically in our lives. We should be living them. So a community of learners, a community of disciples, a community of learners learning together. So what better way to model that than to get people of all ages together learning, and not just learning in the sense of batting around ideas, but going out and doing it.
Yeah.
I heard about a church here recently where the pastor stood up and was preaching from the Gospels, and where Jesus said, if you have 2 coats, give one away. And he said, let's do that this week. If you have more than 1 coat, give one away. So a bunch of people from the church did. That we need more of that. Let's do this. Let's not just talk about it.
Yeah. I heard recently, and I'm interested in your take on it, that the majority of the disciples were teenagers. That other than Peter, who went out a mother-in-law, and Jesus, that Jesus called very young people. What have you heard about that?
You know, I haven't studied that. I know people will say that they were teenagers. They were certainly, part of it is there really weren't teenagers the way we understand it then.
Yeah.
So, you know, a person started taking on adult responsibility quite young, and also they lived in more intergenerational settings. So in a lot of traditional societies, the whole transition to adulthood was different. In a way, what we do in modern societies is kind of the weird, in the sense that we both push them out to be independent very early and kind of give them this huge time to be immature while they're doing that. Whereas the more traditional way was to say, you're kind of an adult and have adult responsibilities, but you're still within the nurturing extended family. And so that was different. So to say they were teenagers, they were young. They were not fully established in life. They were people who could drop everything and come follow him because they didn't have those type of commitments that would keep them from doing that. Although some of them gave up more to do that. But you know, I think age, being young back then was different than it is now. So to call them teenagers almost, I think, is a little misleading. Other than if the point you're trying to make is they were young people, so young people can achieve great things with God's help. Absolutely, that's true. You know, that's one of the things that I'm afraid of, or that I don't like. Ironically, like I said, we have this weird combination of pushing young people out on their own, while kind of insisting that they're not really adults, and they don't even in many cases want to be adults. You know, rather, what we should be saying is, you are young, but you are capable of being a spiritually mature adult. We're going to have lots of grace and help and encouragement. You're part of our extended family, but we're also going to have high expectations for what you can achieve, and we want to encourage you and celebrate those achievements. A book that came out a few years ago that I haven't had a chance to read yet, but I want to, is by a couple of teenage guys, called Do Hard Things. And these young guys were talking to their peers and saying, hey, you know, set your sights higher. Do something important that's a little harder to do.
And that's what maturity is, to a degree.
Absolutely. I mean, maturity is saying, hey, there's something out there that's so good. I'm able to sift through the junk to see what's truly good, what's truly valuable, and I'm going to go after that. And I'm going to realize that I'm going to fail. I'm not perfect. I always need to be growing and learning. That's one of the other things, by the way, that we adults need to communicate to younger people. Younger people think of adulthood as the time when your life is over, you're stagnant, you're no longer growing and developing and joyful as a person. They literally think, and even into their 20s, many 20-somethings think, yes, I would like to get married and settle down sometime, but literally that will be the end of a good part of my life.
Exactly.
Okay, so what we need to, as adults, then we have a role of communicating through testimony, through relationship, through when we're talking about our life in God together, to communicate to them that, adulthood is not stagnant and boring, but I'm learning, I'm growing. This is a good time of life. And so, yeah, we need to communicate that. Otherwise, how will they know? They'll just have this wrong mental image of what adulthood is and not want to get there.
Sure, and I think isn't part of maturity also reaching a plateau or a pinnacle of giving? I think of an infant who's just so dependent, and as one matures, one learns that then one becomes a parent. And so that really the apex of maturity is that you finally discover that your true joy in life is giving and helping those less fortunate.
Well, certainly you see that in a couple of the biblical passages that I mentioned. In Hebrews 5, it's, the author says, by now you should be able to teach others. Ephesians 4, as each part is equipped to do its work, to build up the body in love to maturity. And so, the maturity is a time where you can give back. You're not having to spend so much time and energy on building your internal character that you don't have a lot left over to give to others.
After doing all this research, and as you say, you're writing a follow-up book and you're doing some more, could you go look into your crystal ball for us for a bit, Doctor? And I mean, we've seen this juvenilization going on. Is as the pendulum reached the edge and it's going to come back, or are we going to look at an increasing level of watching Tosh.0 and some of these others, you think, gosh, I didn't think it could get worse, but it does.
Well, I think one of the things that we have not yet come fully to grips with is the impact of the digital revolution. And I think one of the impacts of the digital revolution is just shortened attention span and the different ways that people think and process, and just the level of distraction.
Right.
As someone who I like my quiet alone time with God, but I realize through interacting with my students that for most of them, being alone, being quiet, unplugging from the internet, and focusing on their relationship with God somehow is really difficult, really foreign. And I think that's one of the big things that's already happening, that we're not really realizing the full impact. I mean, younger generations are really tied to their web-enabled devices and experience a kind of a physical pain of fasting from them. Really don't know how to turn off, know that they are distracted and wasting too much time on it, but don't know what to do about it. So I think that's an issue that's going to impact how people even learn or understand or experience their Christian faith. They're going to start going to church and thinking, what? I'm going to sit through a 10-minute sermon? I don't do anything that long. All my YouTube videos are 2 minutes or less. Whatever. That's going to be a big challenge, I think, going forward, is how can we help people truly enter into a deep relationship of prayer and scripture study with the Lord when that's so foreign to how they operate in the rest of life.
Yeah. And how do we? I mean, I imagine that the same Christian disciplines of abstinence, of fasting, of setting limits and making promises has got to have some kind of applicability here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the good news is that people recognize it. People, even the young people I know, recognize that there's something needs to be done here. Some of them are able to take steps to do it. But really, the pace of technology and its invasiveness in our everyday lives has way outpaced our ability to find new ways to, social ways to adapt to it. So, how do we allow these things to be good servants rather than bad masters? Mm-hmm. is going to be a challenge going forward. And I think, for example, one of the things I do is I teach a class on youth culture, and we do a media fast for 3 days, and we do it over the weekend. I make them do it on a weekend, and that's just a good experience for them to realize how connected they are to electronic media all the time, how their life is different without it, and it starts a good conversation. But I think, for the most part, it's one of those areas where we're all kind of aware it's going on, but nobody really knows what to do yet.
Yeah. I
know, for example, in some youth ministries, they have a big box at the door, put all your cell phones in here, until the meeting's over. But, we're facing those kind of things. Other people are celebrating and say, hey, I have no educators who say things like, hey, why would you ever again test anybody on something that they could just Google? Your test questions should be on something deeper or more application-oriented or something.
Right.
So.
Well, that's a unique way of thinking. I mean, we'd never add anything, would we? Or, I mean,
yeah. So I just think that's a big area. If you want the crystal ball, that's a big area that's going to have an even bigger impact going forward, and we're just beginning to grapple with it.
Yeah. The limits that's going to take. Yeah. And so, as we wrap up our time together, Tom, you may have come to the interview with some things you wanted to get across. You may have something on your heart that we haven't been able to unearth with our questions. And I'm wondering if you have any kind of parting thoughts. What is it that God's been doing in your life and that you might want to impart to our listenership of pastors and Christian leaders?
Well, one of the things that I would like to mention, because I know that the way I'm talking about spiritual maturity and pressing us all to consider spiritual maturity and to work towards spiritual maturity can come off in the wrong way, that I don't want it to come off as burdensome or that we're all failing or something. One of the things as I've gotten older, I've realized that, God is very pleased with people who are doing their best to follow Him. And, I used to be sometimes too judgmental of when I visited different churches or whatever, or met different people and thought, oh, they're not living up to this or that. But I've become more and more convinced that, God looks down with eyes of love on all of us and blesses our tiny, small efforts. Really, spiritual maturity is not about putting a burden on one's back, but rather entering into a deeper, truly deeper, more joyful, more powerful relationship with Jesus that will make all of life more joyful. I mean, one of the great things that's been happening for me as I've been thinking and writing a lot about spiritual maturity is throughout my day when I'm confronted with a situation, I have to ask myself, okay, what's the spiritually mature thing to do in this situation? And that's been great for me because it's helped me to realize, you know what? If I look at this through the eyes that I think God wants me to look at it, if I behave in the way try to behave in the way I think God wants me to behave in this situation, I'm going to have a lot more joy about this otherwise tough situation. This is actually going to be better. Wow, my life's actually going to go better. It's not, in other words, spiritual maturity surprisingly doesn't add something to our to-do list so much as it makes our to-do list easier to bear. It makes life the way God meant it to be. And that's a truly wonderful thing.
Great words to end on, Professor Tom Bergler, and the wonderful book, The Juvenilization of American Christianity. Thanks for being my guest on Church
You're
Next.
welcome. Thank you for having me.